The first of these three proofs of high climate sensitivity to CO2 was used by Al Gore in his movie. Gore is obviously much cooler than I am because if you see the movie Inconvenient Truth, he presented this chart spanning across 6 giant screens, which must be a pretty fun way to present. And this for a long time was the smoking gun of CO2 alarmism. Before I talk about what the chart means, I want to discuss how it was created. We want to look at climate thousands, even hundreds of thousands of years ago. But obviously the Geico caveman didn't have a thermometer, and he wasn't writing temperatures down on his cave wall. So we have to find a different way of taking temperatures without actually using thermometers. And the way we do it is to look for natural processes that layer themselves. An obvious example is a tree. Trees have layers. They're called rings, 1 ring per year. You can match each tree ring to a particular year. And so if tree rings somehow had some information in them about climate, we can match this information to a particular year. For example, scientists posit that tree rings are wider in warmer years and narrower in cooler years. Actually, it's more complicated than this, looking at something called late season growth, but you get the concept is the same. The tree ring data is called a proxy for temperature. Another such potential proxy is sediments at the bottom of a lake. Every year, runoff and rivers wash new sediments into the lake. One might look at these sediments and their contents, again matching layers to years, to derive information about plant growth or pollen types, and perhaps form a hypothesis as to what the climate was doing in those years. Stalactites and stalagmites are another example of layering that sometimes contains climate data. Ditto for peat bogs. But the research we first used was ice. Ice in Greenland and Antarctica, which are places where ice, once it's laid down, it seldom melts. One can actually drill through the ice, just like oil companies do in potential oil-bearing strata, and take core samples. Like with tree rings, one can match different layers of the ice to different time periods. And from samples taken from these layers, researchers can infer the regional temperatures when the ice was laid down. They do this by measuring the ratio of certain oxygen isotopes in the ice. They can also measure the composition of microscopic traces of trapped air in the ice to figure out how much CO2 was in the atmosphere when the ice was formed. This is what was done in the chart above. And just looking at the chart, one has to say, wow, as Al Gore says, these two lines fit together. It's just unbelievable. You almost never see independent variables correlate this closely. This looks like CO2 is the main thermostat of the climate system, not just the irrelevant cell phone. This was a smoking gun. But scientists have gotten better at doing this analysis. While we really would like to take and sample annual layers from the ice, we just aren't that good, and besides, who wants to take 600,000 samples? But over time, scientists have been able to take finer and finer slices. And one of the things researchers found as they took finer and finer slices is that these two curves weren't exactly matched. And in fact, the temperature was rising on average 800 years before the CO2 was rising. Now that obviously posed a causality problem. It's like having a body hit the floor and then 2 minutes later the suspect fires his gun. It's hard to call the suspect a murderer when his gunshot occurred after the victim died. As you can imagine, we don't really treat this analysis as a proof anymore of high climate sensitivity to CO2. And I suspect that Gore knew it too, even at the time of his movie. Because he doesn't just say, case closed QED. You have to watch his words, but he says something like, well, the relationship is complicated, but these lines move together. Well, that's a really wimpy way to state your case, particularly given how devastating the correlation seems to be in this chart. What most scientists currently think happened is that rising temperatures actually cause rising CO2 levels rather than the other way around. The oceans actually hold far more CO2 than the air does. The oceans contain substantial dissolved CO2, but their ability to keep CO2 dissolved reduces as the water gets warmer. And so when the oceans heat up, they release CO2 in the air. And that is what has probably happened in this chart. Temperatures rise and oceans heat up, releasing CO2 in the atmosphere, which causes the concentrations to rise. Okay, so much for ice cores. Let's look at proof number 2, that CO2 is the primary driver of the warming we're seeing. This analysis is best known as the hockey stick, originally from Michael Mann. To understand this analysis, it is first useful to review some history. Back in our naive days, before we knew that CO2 was the cause of everything, the IPCC itself produced this analysis of temperatures over the last 1,000 years. You can see what we call the medieval warm period, though we think now this has it dated a little late. And you can see a cold period called the Little Ice Age in the 17th and 18th centuries. And you can see the temperatures today higher than they were a century ago, but not outside the range of the last 1,000 years, and likely still cooler than they were in the Middle Ages. In fact, it was the end of the medieval warm period that caused a whole series of cold weather and crop failures, which led to famines, which many historians say may have weakened the population, making it more susceptible to the Black Death of the mid-14th century. So it was also during this period of time that the Vikings colonized Greenland, which they did not call glacier, cold, uninhabitable land, they called it Greenland. Similarly, we have other historical records in the medieval warm period pointing to a time period potentially warmer than it is today, including records of vineyards in the UK growing grapes where it is too cold to grow them today. Similarly, we have a lot of historical evidence for the Little Ice Age as well. It actually corresponds to the solar phenomenon called the Maunder Minimum, a time when sunspot activity was very low, indicating a relatively dormant period in the sun's output. We have narratives of skating on the Dutch canals and ice fairs on the Thames. Towards the end of this period, we have Washington's terrible winter in Valley Forge and Napoleon's losing battle with the Russian winter in 1812. But it's hard to create a panic about warming when temperatures today are below historical levels when humanity demonstrably prospered, which is why a small cadre of climate researchers set out to eliminate the medieval warm period from the historical record. This is the data series from Michael Mann that Al Gore showed in his movie, though he incorrectly attributed it as Dr. Thompson's thermometer. Apparently he or his staff pulled the wrong chart out of a published journal for the movie. This same analysis was the centerpiece of the IPCC third assessment. To create this chart, Michael Mann and his team used tree ring data to reconstruct temperatures over the last 1,000 years. He used about 400 or so different tree ring samples or proxy series. From this analysis he concluded, hey, there's no medieval warm period, there's no little ice age, and temperatures have been astoundingly constant for 1,000 years until we started burning fossil fuels, and then temperatures took off in an unprecedented manner. And if this were the true picture, one would say, gee, maybe we are doing something unusual to the climate. Maybe these climate alarmists have a point, because it surely looks like the Earth's temperatures were awfully stable until we started burning stuff. The whole issue of the hockey stick has resurfaced again of late with the release of the internal emails from the CRU at East Anglia University. These emails seem to point to a range of either sloppiness or outright malfeasance in temperature reconstructions like this hockey stick. So much so that a number of prominent alarmists have actually declared that a hockey stick doesn't matter and never really was critical evidence, an odd claim since it was clearly the featured centerpiece analysis of the third IPCC assessment, was given significant coverage in the fourth assessment as well as in Al Gore's movie. So it is for no other reason than to open a window in the scientific process. I will give this and subsequent reconstructions a bit of attention. The first issue that comes up over and over in evaluating these many tree ring studies like Michael Mann's is one of statistical method. I've had the opportunity to visually inspect over 1,000 proxy series, and it's hard to escape the conclusion that there are very, very few hockey stick shaped curves in the individual proxy data, maybe 5 in every 100, and that's generous. So it is no real surprise that if you take Michael Mann's original 450 tree ring proxies and you just graph the simple mean, it looks like the top graph. The average output from the proxy series just looks like random noise, certainly with no discernible hockey stick trend. An experienced statistician but climate amateur named Steve McIntyre started looking into the hockey stick years ago because he couldn't understand what statistical methods Mann was using to get hockey stick averages from raw data that didn't seem to contain hockey stick shaped series. And what McIntyre eventually demonstrated was that Mann had created an algorithm that essentially mathematically cherry-picked hockey stick shaped curves in the data and emphasized them with large weights in the final roll-up. So much so that McIntyre was able to feed Mann's algorithm randomly generated proxy series, essentially noise, and obtain hockey stick shaped results. At the end of the day, trees make really bad thermometers. Sure, they grow more or less rapidly depending on the temperature, but they can also change growth rates based on precipitation, changing soil chemistry, and even changing CO2 in the atmosphere. Further, the relationship between growth and temperature may not be linear and may even change over time. It turns out that a lot of trees Mann used are actually fertilized by CO2. That means that they grow faster when there's more CO2 in the air. So have his trees grown faster over the last 100 years because they were warmer or because they were being fertilized by increases in CO2? Is he measuring temperature or CO2 concentrations?